Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm thankful for the opportunity to speak again on C-7, an act to amend the Criminal Code, medical assistance in dying at report stage. I'll touch on two key amendments that the Conservatives were seeking, namely to maintain a reflection period of 10 clear days between when the request for aid is signed and then received, and then to extend the assessment period from 90 to 120 days for those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. Originally, these are amendments that we put forward at committee. In fact, these are just two of several amendments that we worked really hard to achieve in good faith, but were all rejected by the Liberals. Therefore, I would first contend that the bill we have received back from the committee demonstrates a lack of concern for voices of opposition, and not merely that of our Conservative opposition, but rather that of the differently abled and medical experts whose concerns we compassionately championed. We must thoughtfully consider the alarm of Canadians who are passionately opposed to what C-7 is now proposing. C-7 would eliminate the requirement of waiting 10 clear days after being approved for the procedure, effectively allowing for a system of death on demand. As we've heard in committee, this is troubling for those whose lives have been affected by disability. For those who want to live with dignity, C-7 presents a clear and a very present danger to them. That's what they're saying. Speaker, let's refer to what witnesses told us at committee. Roger Foley, who lives with a severe neurodegenerative disease, told the committee, and I quote, "With the assisted dying regime in Canada, I have experienced the lack of care and assistance I need to live. I've been abused and berated because I have disabilities and told that my care needs are too much work. My life has been devalued. I have been coerced into assisted death by abuse, neglect, lack of care, and threats." Mr. Foley went on to say assisted dying is easier to access than safe and appropriate disability supports to live. You MPs have turned your backs on the disabled and elderly Canadians, end quote. I found that very difficult to hear. Dr. Ewan Gallagher, a physician scientist, was clear in his assertion that C-7 singles out those with disabilities when, in many cases, death can be prevented. He said, and I quote, "Bill C-7 declares that an entire class of people, those with physical disabilities, are potentially appropriate for suicide, that their lives are potentially not worth living. Indeed, were it not for their disability, we would not be willing to end them. I cannot imagine a more degrading and discriminatory message from our society to communicate to our fellow citizens living with disabilities." While reflecting understandable empathy for often severe suffering, the bill conforms to an ableist presumption that a life with disability or chronic illness is less worth living, end quote. Krista Carr, Executive Vice President of Inclusion Canada, spoke on behalf of families of those with intellectual disabilities who fear that their loved ones will be left without a choice. She said that, quote, "Families now fear that their family members will be encouraged to end their lives, rather than addressing their suffering as we do for every other Canadian who tries to end their suffering through suicide. Their lives are now judged as not worth saving," end quote. This claim of Ms. Carr's was reinforced by the testimony of Taylor Hyatt, who bravely shared a personal story. Having been admitted to the ER with difficulty breathing, the doctor advised her that the particular infection could require oxygen. Ms. Hyatt enthusiastically agreed to the use of oxygen, but she found it troubling that her answer came as a surprise to the doctor. And I know Taylor, and she is full of energy and life. It was at this point that Taylor came to a stark realization. She said, "In that moment, I would have been able to refuse treatment and be permitted to die. Or, in a moment of weakness, brought on into the stereotype that my life wasn't worth living and requested and received a lethal injection. Breathing supports would be considered standard treatment for a non-disabled person in my situation. If this bill goes through, how many more disabled people at their lowest moments could have a drastically different and decidedly unwanted ending to their story," end quote. Speaker, we on this side of the House recognize that Canadians' tolerance for assisted dying has evolved over the past 4.5 years. In fact, a 2020 Angus Reid Institute poll found that 4 in 5 Canadians believe that it should be easier to make their own end-of-life decisions, compared to 73% 4 years ago. However, the same poll found that 65% believe the option of assisted suicide and euthanasia has the potential to intensify pressure on those with disabilities to choose death as a means to avoid being a burden to others. They want lawmakers and they want the courts to give significant weight to this concern. In my view, C-7 abandons the concerns of witnesses and the majority view of Canadians. Appropriate safeguards, such as the 10-day reflection period and a 120-day assessment period for those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, are absolutely warranted. So why are the Liberals denying this? Speaker? My second point as to why this bill should not proceed is because of this government's clear intention to go beyond the scope of Quebec Courts of Appeal's Truchon decision. One of the key elements of this bill for me is the about-face that the government has taken. Less than 5 years ago, C-14 was passed. It was a bill that I and many in my party oppose in principle from its introduction to the present day. However, many Canadians took solace in the fact that C-14 contained a vital element of parliamentary accountability. Clause 10 mandated a 5-year review wherein the provisions of the assisted suicide law, as well as the state of palliative care in Canada, would be fulsomely studied by the House of Commons and Senate before the end of June 2021. This was our responsibility. This vital element of C-14 has been ignored by this government. As parliamentarians, we have now been tasked to consider a massive expansion of assisted suicide and euthanasia without a clear enough understanding of C-14's effectiveness, enforceability, and areas of acute concern. I think it bears repeating from my speech in October. Rather than appeal Truchon to the Supreme Court of Canada or wait for the all-important 5-year review of assisted death in Canada, the Liberals have chosen to run with the Truchon decision and legislate on an expansion of assisted death for the entire country. Not only that, the bill far exceeds the scope of Truchon. Indeed, during oral questions on November 23rd, the member for Vancouver-Granville, the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General and author of the original MAID legislation, called into question the government's effort to eliminate the 10-day reflection period and reconfirmation of consent through C-7. She said, and I quote, "Nothing in the Truchon decision of the Quebec Court of Appeal, which the government chose not to appeal, requires this, and the Supreme Court of Canada in Carter insisted on the requirement of clear consent. Palliative care physicians, disability advocates, and other experts insist that this is an important safeguard. And like other legislated MAID reports on mature minors and mental disorder, advance requests also raise significant challenges," end quote. Speaker, the government clearly has its own agenda here. The Liberals appear determined to eliminate safeguards for the most vulnerable when it was not instructed to do so. This is coupled with the fact that this House has not had the benefit of a fulsome study of the original MAID legislation. This House should proceed with the adoption of our very reasonable amendments. Canadians want them. Finally, I'd like to reiterate a point from my last intervention on this bill. The Liberals continue to lag on a national strategy for palliative care, but at the same time, they're moving forward on more accessibility to MAID. The Liberals broke their promise to invest $3 billion in long-term care, including palliative care, and have yet to bring Canadians a national strategy on palliative care that they promised and agreed to. Just as 80% of Canadians believe it should be easier to make end-of-life decisions, 70% of Canadians continue to live without any access to palliative care. That's why the Liberals' approach is nonsensical. The Angus Reid poll found that 62% of Canadians want us in this place to give the due attention to the concerns that our healthcare system will. They're concerned that they're going to begin to ignore long-term care and chronic disease amongst the elderly as MAID becomes more widely accessible and routine. We're seeing this happen, Madam Speaker. Furthermore, 7 in 10 Canadians want us as lawmakers to consider whether increased access to assisted suicide and euthanasia will mean less investment in traditional palliative care. I dread that. In my view, that situation is already unfolding. I refer again to the Delta Hospice Society, where 10 hospice beds are at risk of being defunded. Why? Because of their refusal to provide assisted suicide to their patients. The Hospice Society believes that MAID is distinct from and violates the very purpose of the palliative care that they are very proud to provide. Indeed, President Angela Ireland has been clear that their intention is not to overturn MAID. They are not a threat, but only to uphold its approach to end-of-life care that so many Canadians want, deserve, and do not have access to. A majority of Canadians would side with the position of the Hospice Society. Again, referring to the Angus Reid poll, 55% of Canadians reported that religious hospitals should be free to refuse to participate in MAID on moral grounds. Any attempt to cheapen the value of palliative care should be of concern to this House. In the words of Dr. Gallagher, quote, "The goal of healthcare is to help the patient flourish. Palliative care is about helping the patients flourish even as they go through the process of dying. I think anything that accelerates or hastens that process and doesn't give the opportunity for reflection and so on is of serious concern." End quote.
And I'm sorry, but we have to go to questions. I'm sorry, but we have to go to questions and comments. Questions et commentaires à l'honorable député. I know see, but it's a very long one. Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Lakes, and Rideau Lakes. Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
Thanks very much, Madam Speaker. I appreciate it, and I want to thank my colleague for her very thoughtful speech on this important subject. I thought that her example about the disabled individual who had that a very different experience than a Canadian without a disability who might experience. And I heard a similar story about an individual who was it was apparent that they had a physical disability. And when suffering a seizure, the very first question that they were asked was if they had a do not resuscitate, a DNR order. So my question to the member, Madam Speaker, is why is it important that Parliament give a thoughtful review, as was committed at the 5-year mark, instead of having this hasty process which goes beyond the Supreme Court or the Quebec court decision, which was not appealed by the government? Why is having a proper review where stakeholders, including from the disability community, can speak to parliamentarians, testify about their concerns, have their questions answered, and have the government answer for why they would make those decisions? Why is that process important, and why would that be preferential to what we're seeing happening right now?
The Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
Well, I thank my colleague and friend for that very good question. There's such concern in my heart for the fact that this government is choosing on so many occasions to go over and above its own responsibilities within the realm of our House of Parliament, where we have 338 members who have voted, who have made the decision in having C-14 come forward with the understanding that that proper oversight would take place. This is a huge issue for Canada, and we have a responsibility as parliamentarians to do the due research to find out how well it has been functioning. Has it been abused? And clearly we are hearing those stories over and over again now, and yet this government has chosen to move ahead and rush this. And of course, those who wanted to speak to that review have had to try to make their voices heard and known in the midst of the presentation of C-7. And we know that many of them were shut down at committee. We did not extend testimony time, and there were very many reports and dockets that were not able to be submitted because there wasn't time. Thank goodness that that time is also being taken in the Senate. I feel that this government has abused its responsibilities.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and honourable colleague from Cypress Hills Grasslands. This is a very significant piece of legislation. I support it completely. We did attempt amendments through the member for Nanaimo Ladysmith for the Greens in the committee, but I think it's terribly important that we not conflate medical assistance in dying, and as a number of Conservatives have done in this debate, and my honourable friend in her speech did not do this, but did refer to assisted suicide. Some speeches have just called it suicide, and euthanasia. That is not the effect of this legislation. This legislation is for medical assistance in dying for a very limited group of people who would qualify, and specifically does not include mental illness specifically. So I asked my honourable colleague to consider again whether there is a cost to people across this country who believe the rhetoric of the Conservatives and now experience additional anxiety and a thought that Canada is losing its moral compass because the rhetoric being used in this debate is unworthy of the very good people who are using this language.
Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
Well, I thank my colleague for the question. However, I totally disagree with her premise here, because the people who we are hearing from over and over again and coming to us for compassionate intervention are the very people who are feeling threatened by this particular legislation. Those who are disabled, and I know that many of them do face very hard challenges, but many of them as well are very capable in many other ways, as I can assure you Taylor Hyatt is. And so my concern here is that assisted suicide or assisted dying is something that is being encouraged in a way that I'm concerned as well for my veterans who are told over and over again not to go that direction. And yet we are facing a situation here where we are not keeping in those safeguards that would ensure that these people who are asking to be protected, they have the right to be protected in the midst of this legislation.